Welcome to Lost Legends, where we dive into long-forgotten tales of love, loss, and monsters. I'm Josh, and as this is the inaugural video here on the channel, I thought I'd take a few moments to introduce myself and to give you a taste of what you can expect to see in this and future videos. The original inspiration for this channel goes back to a series of videos that I made years ago called Legends and Tales, where I would dive into legends and uncover the truth about their history. As fun as that series was to make, it never really found its footing on YouTube, and other commitments that I had wound up pulling me away from making it. The idea for it never left me though, and when I decided to revive the series and give it its own channel, I wanted to do things just a little bit differently. I want these videos to be a little more laid back, with a slower pace where I can tell the stories that I find in a way that really lets them breathe. Over the first several videos, I'll be retelling a lot of the tales that I've covered in the past in a more relatable and relaxed way. But as we go along, I've got a lot of new stories to tell and share, and I hope that you'll join me on that journey. My plan is to upload 1 to 2 videos a month, as I want to take my time on them and be as thorough as possible. Most of the videos will have a couple of stories in them, with a theme tying them together so that they're perfect for those evenings where you just want to sit back, grab a drink, and listen to new and intriguing tales pulled straight from history. My love for the macabre and spooky goes back to my childhood. My mom would load my brothers and I, usually along with a family friend and their kids, into the old Chevy Astro van that we had, and we'd cruise the back roads of Ohio looking for ghosts. Many of the stories that we'd chase came from a book that Mom had called Haunted Ohio, and some of them came straight from local legends that people would whisper about on dark nights. There was the tale of Sarah, the witch who cheated on her husband and met a grisly fate when he caught her and her lover one foggy evening as they shared a passionate rendezvous. Her lover was killed on the spot, but death wasn't enough to kill a witch. Knowing that there was only one way to keep her from cursing him, her husband cut off her head and buried it and her body in separate locations. If you drive down the right road on the right night, you can see her wandering the side of the road, her ghost searching in vain for her lost head. Then there was the ghost of a little girl named Susie, who died in a house fire when she ran back inside to retrieve her doll. On nights where the full moon shone bright through the trees, you could still see the outline of the house's smoking ruins, even as it had been years since it had been torn down. If you took a baby doll to the site, like we did a couple of times, and uttered, "Susie, I have your doll," a little girl would come walking out of the shadows looking for the toy that she died to save. Sad to say that never actually happened for us. One of my favorites, though, and one that I turned into a short horror story, was the Ghost Rider of Elmore. A young man went off to war, leaving the love of his life behind to defend his country. Upon returning, he discovered that she had married another while he was away, and in his grief, he rode his motorcycle over the side of a bridge, losing his head in the process. If you sat near the bridge in your car and honked your horn and flashed your lights, he would appear and relive his final ride one more time. Of course, all of these are legends and none of them have any historical backing to support them, but not all tragic tales are fictional. In adulthood, the love of ghosts and those tales led me to wandering cemeteries in my free time, searching for out-of-place wanderers and spooky feelings. It was one of those trips to a cemetery near Bellefontaine, Ohio, where I would begin the journey that would ultimately lead me to the Legends and Tales series and this channel. Let's step back in time for a moment to September of 1875. The war between the states is still fresh in most people's minds, and the nation is still healing from the wounds inflicted when President Lincoln was struck down at the Ford Theater. Spiritualism is at the height of its popularity. Henry Ford is still decades away from putting the first horseless carriage out on the streets of America, and Alexander Graham Bell is on the verge of securing the very first patent for a new invention called the telephone. Among all of this, a man named Josiah Laughlin is living in a small town of Bell Center, Ohio, with his wife and daughter Sarah, known better by her nickname, Allie. Josiah owns a small farm, and while he can manage much of the work on his own, there are a few things that he's needed help with over the years. To make things run a little smoother, Josiah has taken on farm hands from time to time. But one hand in particular has been by his side for several years. James Shell moved from Ohio to Canada sometime in the 1860s, and after meeting his wife Melinda in Madison County, he moved to Bell Center in Logan County in search of work. Josiah took a quick liking to James, even as many in town saw the man as nothing more than a scoundrel. And even though James worked for Josiah, the two men considered themselves good friends. James had a trio of daughters, all under the age of 10, and one of the girls, Esther, looked up to Allie Laughlin as an older sister of sorts. She would follow Allie around whenever she was able to visit. And although Allie would sometimes find this behavior a little annoying, she grew fond of the girl as well. Now, back in the 1870s, much like today, people would often take trips out to the country to pick berries, nuts, plums, and other things. And back then there was a lot more country, and people were often doing it to supplement their available food rather than just for fun. The Shell family often traveled out to the Lewistown Reservoir, modern-day Indian Lake, to a spot where the berries and nuts were plentiful to fill their baskets, making a day of the affair before heading home late in the afternoon. One of these trips, on September 22, 1875, would wind up changing the world of the Laughlins and the Shells forever. The evening before, Esther had gone over to ask Allie if she would like to join the Shell family for a trip out to the lake the next morning. Allie was delighted to say yes, though she wasn't able to spend the night at the Shell house as Esther had wanted, thanks to some chores that she needed to complete around her own house. Early the next morning, James pulled his wagon up to the Laughlin house, and Esther ran out to greet Allie, giving her a big hug as the older girl walked out into the crisp morning air. Once everyone was loaded back onto the wagon, they set off for Indian Lake. The wagon ride took a couple of hours. Horses are a lot slower than cars after all, and roads weren't exactly paved back then. But by late morning, they were finally pulling up to the spot that James had picked out. The first order of business was a light lunch packed by Melinda before the group set out for the day. And once everyone had eaten and cleaned up, they began spreading out to search for nuts and wild plums. After a short while, they'd picked most of the plums in the area, and James decided to head off to a nearby thicket that he knew about to grab some more. He may have asked Allie to go with him, or she may have volunteered, but either way, she wound up accompanying him into the deeper part of the woods, where the pair would be gone for a couple of hours while Melinda and the three Shell children continued searching for nuts. And this is where things take a real turn, because James would come back from the thicket alone, with the story of what happened changing depending on who was telling it. The initial tale, one that James would stick to until the moment of his death, was that he and Allie had become separated in the thicket. He said that he was surprised to find that Allie had not returned to the wagon when he got back. Melinda would tell a different story, though. She said that James returned to the wagon alone, confessing that he'd killed Allie in a fit of passion, and that he'd threatened to do the same to her if she told anyone. But blame would have to wait, at least in the short term, as the moments following James's return to the wagon were fraught with worry. The girl, after all, was only missing at first, even as you can see where this is going. James sent Melinda back to town to retrieve a search party, and he set out to find as many locals as he could to help with the search in the meantime. It would take a few hours to gather enough searchers, and a few more to organize and begin the search, but in the wee hours of the next morning, they would finally locate the remains of Allie Laughlin. She'd been beaten and stabbed, and her skull was fractured, telling a grisly tale. Someone really had it in for her, and all eyes were on James Shell. James was arrested, having been the last person to see her alive and all, and he was taken to the county jail in nearby Bellefontaine, where the coroner's inquest was set up to figure out the truth of what happened in the woods near Indian Lake. Fun fact, the term coroner goes back to medieval England, and it basically means officer of the crown, referring to someone who acted as the king's eyes and ears in disputes to help protect his property and financial interests. I bring this up because coroner's inquests come up a lot in these older tales, and I'm willing to bet that a lot of people have no idea what the term even means. Whenever there was a crime or a major event, especially involving odd deaths or tragedies, a group was assembled to act as a sort of jury to ascertain the facts of the event. They didn't have a lot of legal power, though they could summon witnesses and compel testimony. These still happen in a limited capacity today, but they were super popular in the 19th century as a lot of small towns were hours away from the bigger cities, and the fastest way to get information for a situation was to set up a local group. And getting the information written down in an official way while it was still fresh in everyone's minds was pivotal to figuring out how someone died and in helping to charge anyone potentially responsible later on. In the case of Allie Laughlin, the coroner's inquest was a massive affair, with people for miles around gathering outside the courthouse to hear details from others who would listen in and relay the information to the crowd as it came out outside. And the inquest is where the testimony from Melinda and James I mentioned a few minutes ago first surfaced. James said that he and Allie became separated, and that he thought that she'd gone back to the wagon, but Melinda told a much darker tale. So she said that James had told her the night before that he was planning to assault Allie, and he said that if the girl resisted, he was going to kill her. She also said that he confessed his actions to her the moment that he emerged from the woods. Now, that was obviously stunning testimony to hear, but if you think that it sounds inflammatory now, a century and a half after the fact, imagine how the crowd gathered outside the courthouse felt. People were already livid that something so horrible could happen to such a beautiful young woman, and hearing Melinda's testimony as it was relayed riled up the crowd even more. It didn't help that most of the locals who knew James didn't really like him, and most of them had probably already made up their minds about his guilt before they even heard what his wife had to say. As the inquest dragged on, the crowd outside grew, and the early rumblings of men wanting to take justice into their own hands became outright calls to hang James in the street. The sheriff worked hard to calm the mass, which contained over 1,000 people by late in the evening, but he could only do so much. The angry mob wanted justice, and they were going to get it come hell or high water. At one point, in a moment of desperation, the sheriff offered to smuggle James out of the city in an attempt to save his life, if he would confess his guilt. James refused the offer, however, saying that he wouldn't confess to a crime that he didn't commit. Now, that might have been hubris, or perhaps he really was innocent. See, part of the coroner's inquest was an autopsy of the body, and one of the things that they found was a clump of long, dark hair clasped in Allie's hand. James had shorter brown hair, but Melinda had long black hair that seemed to match the evidence. But why didn't that come out? Well, it took a little too long to do the investigation. Or should I say that it took a little too long for the crowd that had been foaming at the mouth outside for days. They wanted someone to pay, and James was the perfect patsy. At around 11 o'clock on the night of the 24th of September, the mob broke through the doors of the courthouse and made their way slowly through the iron doors protecting James inside the jail. It had to be kind of difficult to get to him, all things considered, and they broke all kinds of laws in the process, including tying up the sheriff and the deputies. But it wouldn't be a ruthless mob without some blatant disregard for health and safety. After what was likely a couple of hours of breaking down doors and searching cells, James was pulled outside and forced through the crowd to a makeshift gallows that had been erected near the street. A rope had been tossed over a tree branch, and a stool stood below it, and within moments, James found himself standing on the stool, a noose tied around his neck as the men below debated whether to hang him right away or let him have some final words. In the end, they elected to give him the chance to share his side of things, though it wouldn't really matter much. He said that his wife killed the girl, and that she was extremely jealous of Allie because James had bought the girl candy at some point, and Melinda was convinced that he was going to leave her at some point for Allie. In a desperate moment, James was even reported as saying, "Do you suppose I'd do such a thing? Mr. Laughlin was my best friend." None of his pleas were enough to convince the crowd, however, as they had a thirst for blood that needed to be quenched. He was accused of several other crimes by random people in the mob, including another murder that had happened in the recent past, but all of that was forgotten as they gave him the chance to utter what would become his last words. "I hope the Lord will have mercy on me and on all of you." It's kind of a weird thing to think about a man's last words, especially when those last words were spoken at the end of a noose. He could have said anything he wanted. He could have confessed and begged for forgiveness, or even pled for his life. But he chose to plead for mercy for himself and those hanging him from the Almighty. That just strikes me as odd. Like, he probably knew in the moment that there was no way out, but I think that most people, innocent or guilty, would have broken down in tears, maybe begged to be set free. But the saga wasn't even over at that point, as the sheriff had to cut James down the next morning, and the investigation had to continue into Allie's death. Like I said, there was the hair discovered in her hand, and James's claim about Melinda couldn't just be brushed off. What if she had actually killed the girl? Unfortunately, that line never really went far. Melinda was arrested and held for a time in the jail as an accomplice to murder, but the charges were dropped after a short time, and she would wind up disappearing with her children, likely back to live with her family in Madison County. Nearly 30 years after the murder, a man calling himself Charles Shell would show up in Bellefontaine, claiming to be the son of James and asking to see the jail cell where his father had been held. Before the sheriff had the chance to show him the place, however, the man left town and was never seen again. There are so many oddities to this story, and with it being so long ago, it's likely we'll never have all of the facts. Realistically, there's a very good chance that James committed the crime on his own, but we can't rule out Melinda being involved or even doing it herself. It would be interesting to travel back in time with the ability to check DNA and analyze the scene of the crime, though I have to wonder if even having the technology that we have today would have saved an innocent man from the gallows given the circumstances. People have a tendency to jump to conclusions, to form opinions before all of the facts are in. And once those conclusions have been formed, it's nearly impossible to change them regardless of the facts. That crowd would have likely hanged James even if Melinda had confessed to the crime herself, because they had already made up their minds of his guilt. They were even trying to pin other crimes on him, and would have probably hung him for those if nothing else. It's a lesson that we can take away in the modern era, because that's something that hasn't changed one bit in over 150 years. People are still quick to jump to conclusions, and will ignore facts when they don't line up with what they've already decided. It's known as cognitive dissonance, and you can overcome it by detaching yourself from your opinions and beliefs and following the evidence to conclusions instead of doing it the other way around. And that's one of the most important things that we can take away from this first story. History is one of the greatest teachers. We can learn so much from the past, and looking into legends and events from so long ago can help us learn more about ourselves and better ourselves even today. But sometimes the bad guy in the story isn't quite as murky as the situation with James Shell. And in the next tale, we'll meet someone that definitely deserved his fate, though his true story isn't as clear as the legend might suggest. Three decades prior to the death of Allie, there was another tragedy that hit Logan County, though this one would stretch far beyond the borders of Ohio and would be remembered for generations. In 1820, a man named Andrew Hellman moved to the United States from Germany. This was his second trip to the young nation, with his first being a temporary stint where he apprenticed as a tailor in Baltimore, Maryland. His second trip would be more permanent though, starting out in Logan County, Virginia, where he would spend a couple of years working as a farmhand for a man named George Abel. Mr. Abel had several children, and one of them, Mary, was smitten with Andrew right away. It was love at first sight, and by 1821 the pair were saying their vows and promising to love each other until death do they part. But it wasn't all as perfect as it seemed. See, Andrew was known to have some pretty bad views when it came to women, and he'd never been one to treat them with any respect or care. What Mary saw in him we'll likely never know, but she was able to overlook his flaws, and not long after being wed, they welcomed their first baby, a daughter named Louisa, into the world. A year later, Louisa would get a brother named Henry, and the first public signs of trouble would arise with the family. See, Andrew claimed that Mary was cheating on him, and that Henry wasn't his child. He would not only scream and berate Mary, calling her all kinds of names, but he would also go so far as to disown Henry completely and refuse to acknowledge that he was his son. Many in the community assumed that that would be the end of the marriage, but the couple managed to work things out, and in 1824 they moved to a small farm of their own to focus on raising and growing their family. For a while, things seemed to be going all right, or as good as they could go with Andrew involved. And in 1827, they even welcomed the third child, John, into the world. The growing family was in need of a little bit more space, though, and the solution to their problem would come when Mary's father, who found himself wanting to leave something behind for his children at an old age, decided to gift each of his children a plot of land. Now, Mary's plot, purchased in 1831, was near Carrollton in Carroll County, Ohio. And while she was thrilled to have something to call her own, Andrew wasn't too happy that the land wasn't in his name. Overlooking that flaw in the short term, Andrew focused on working the land and building up the farm for his family, having enough success that he was even able to buy an additional plot to expand the family farm a couple of years after moving in. Try as he might, however, he was unable to get over the land being in his wife's name. And in 1836, he managed to sell the land in Carroll County and buy a new farm further west in the small town of Bellefontaine, Ohio. Ideally, that would have been the end of things, and they would have lived happily ever after. Andrew had a large parcel of land in his name. A couple of Mary's brothers lived nearby, allowing her to visit with family whenever she wanted, and the area was perfect for raising their 3 kids. But there wouldn't be much of a story if it had all worked out. Andrew seemed to be getting angrier as the years went on, and while some in town had come to expect his outbursts, it wasn't so easy for Mary to deal with at home. He would yell constantly, and he would treat the family like they were animals that he owned, rather than human beings that he was supposed to love and care for. But anger wasn't all that was going on, as Mary suspected that he was trying to kill her off. Her full reasons for feeling that way aren't known, but there was at least one instance that caused her to take note that something was a little bit off. She was having a glass of milk one morning when she noticed a white powdery substance clinging to the cup just before she took her first sip. Unsure of what it could be, she threw the milk out and started searching for evidence that Andrew was trying to poison her. Now, she wasn't able to find anything concrete, but it wouldn't be long before things got much, much worse. In 1839, all 3 children fell ill at the same time. Mary was sure that Andrew had managed to poison them somehow, and she sought help from the local doctor, who tried his best, but ultimately failed to save both Louisa and John, who died within 48 hours of taking ill. Henry managed to recover, and if only forensic science back then was as good as it is today, the cause of death of his siblings may have been ascertained before things got any more out of hand. Shortly after Henry recovered, his mother sent him to spend some time with his uncle, who had taken ill himself and needed some help on his farm. The boy was a great help, and after a couple of days, Mary's sister-in-law, Rachel, made the trip from her farm to the Hellman farm to thank Mary for sending Henry over. But that trip would be the beginning of a roller coaster, the likes of which Logan County had never seen. Arriving at the house, Rachel found a scene straight out of a horror movie. Andrew was clinging to life, covered in blood and laying sprawled out on the bed in the main room. Barely conscious, he managed to point Rachel to the back room, where she discovered the body of Mary, beaten beyond recognition and lying on the floor dead. Fleeing the house, Rachel made her way home, where her husband George took charge and led a group of men back to the scene of the crime. Within hours, a coroner's jury had been assembled, and George was accusing Andrew of killing Mary. The jury was skeptical at first, and it was only after a thorough examination of the house and having a doctor check Andrew for injuries that they started to come around. The doctor that examined Andrew found that the man had no injuries of note, and questions started to come up about whose blood he was actually covered in. Andrew's story, at least initially, was that a pair of robbers had forced their way in 2 days prior, killing Mary and injuring him in their attempt to steal whatever valuables they could find. That story fell apart rather quickly, however, and in the end, the coroner's jury concluded that Andrew had most likely killed his wife, covering himself in her blood and staging the scene that Rachel found 2 days later. A bloody axe was found along with a knife that was used, and the evidence from the scene was pointing to Mary being struck first while she was sleeping and only dying after several blows were made. Andrew was arrested and officially charged with the murder, and he was locked up in jail in Bellefontaine to await his trial. But that trial would never come. After being charged officially, he requested a trial in front of the Ohio Supreme Court. The problem was that the Supreme Court only met once a year, and they only had a couple of days left in the term before going on recess. Because of that, his trial was postponed, and he was held without bond in the Bellefontaine jail while he awaited his day in court. In the colder months, and on especially cold days, Andrew would be brought out of his cell and kept in the room above the jail so that he didn't freeze to death. In theory, he would have been under guard this whole time, but apparently that wasn't always the case. And on a cold evening in November of 1840, when no one called to take him back to his cell, Andrew walked out the door and into the night as a free man. What happened next isn't completely known. He managed to get a hold of a horse, which some would later speculate was given to him by his attorney, and he rode off into the night to never be seen again. Well, not officially seen for the next 3 years. It's 1843, and we're heading east to Reisterstown, Maryland, where a man named Adam Horn is dealing with questions about his missing wife, Melinda. He swears that he hasn't seen her for weeks, and that she left him in the middle of the night wearing only her nightgown. Her sister Catherine isn't buying the story though, and has been relentlessly searching for Melinda. A small group assisted in the hunt, likely spurred on by Catherine's urging that her sister wouldn't have gone missing on her own. And after days of what must have felt like a never-ending nightmare, a breakthrough finally happened. It wasn't the kind of ending that Catherine had been hoping for, though. A burlap sack containing the torso of the missing woman was found partially buried in an orchard near town. Growing more suspicious of the husband, because it always seems to be the spouse in these kind of things, the police searched the Horn residence and wound up discovering another sack containing Melinda's arms and legs, before finding what was left of her head in the wood-burning stove. Through all of this, Adam had disappeared, and Melinda's autopsy revealed a possible motive that he might have had for killing his wife. It turned out she was around 4 months pregnant at the time of her death. Now, a nationwide manhunt, or the closest thing that they had to that in 1843, took place in the following days, with a description of Adam being sent to police departments all over the country. That description would pique the interest of two police agencies. The first would be a police department in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where Adam Horn would wind up being arrested for the murder of Melinda in September of 1843. And the second would be the police department in Logan County, Ohio, where Sheriff Slicer would recognize the description as that of Andrew Hellman. Sheriff Slicer would make his way to Maryland to meet Adam Horn, and within seconds of seeing the man, he was able to positively ID him as the accused killer who'd managed to escape in 1840. That kind of made things a little bit messy, though. See, Adam Horn, aka Andrew Hellman, was now wanted for trial in two places for two different murders. And the only way that he could be tried for both would be for the higher authorities, like governors, to work together. He would need to be extradited from Maryland to Ohio so that he could be tried with the murder of Mary, but that wasn't going to happen. Maryland's governor, Francis Thomas, denied the extradition request, reportedly saying that Hellman/Horn could be sent to Ohio to face charges there if something happened that caused his charges in Maryland to not be successful. But that Maryland trial would end in a guilty verdict, with Andrew being convicted of 2 counts of murder, one for Melinda and one for her unborn child. In November of 1843, he was sentenced to hang, and on February 1st, 1844, he went to the gallows. The event drew crowds of between 10,000 and 30,000 people to watch, and his son Henry, whom he had reconciled with after purportedly finding God, was there to say goodbye. Unlike Allie, Andrew's tale would become a legend over time, with stories of the Hatchet Man becoming popular in Ohio folklore. In fact, it was those very stories that first brought me down the rabbit hole of learning the truth behind Ohio legends, eventually sparking the Ohio Legends and Tales series. The legend was that Andrew Hellman had murdered his whole family with a hatchet and was buried next to them in the cemetery in Logan County. It was said that if you went out to the bridge near the cemetery late at night and shut off your car and rolled down your windows, that Andrew would come out and get you. It was also well known that his gravestone would glow at night. To be absolutely clear, while the location of Hellman's grave wasn't publicized, it was most likely somewhere near Baltimore, Maryland, where he was hanged. No one was going to pay to have him carted hundreds of miles to be buried next to the wife that he murdered, and there is no record of him being laid to rest in that cemetery. That's one of the things that really fascinates me about these legends, though. In the modern age, it's pretty normal to have things get twisted and move at the speed of light around the world. We live in an age where terms like fake news dominate the headlines, and it's really easy to blame distortions on things like social media and the internet. The fact is, though, that legends like that of the Hatchet Man show just how distorted things can get even without the World Wide Web. Stories about Andrew Hellman were circulating before things like Google, YouTube, and Facebook and others existed. Word of mouth was the name of the game, and books like Haunted Ohio were part of how the false information was spread. Now, I should add here that I don't necessarily think that there was malice involved, or that anyone was purposefully lying. Legends require very long-term games of telephone, where each person shares the tale as it was told to them, with maybe an added detail or two, and the creepy stories on a spooky evening around a campfire make for a great time all around. The idea behind what I'm doing here on Lost Legends is to dig deeper than the surface, to explore the true history behind the legends, whether they've been passed down through word of mouth or as an engraving on a headstone that few will ever see. As we forge on, we've got monsters, ghosts, and other things that go bump in the night to explore. And each tale comes with a moral. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on future videos. And for those who are interested, I also have a Patreon where you can get early access to videos as well as access to other projects that I've got in the works on this and other channels. That will all be linked in the description below. For now, I want to thank you all for watching. Keep an eye on the past, and I'll see you in the next Lost Legends.
Once had a dream before, standing on the chessboard floor, marble pillars out this castle, clopping hooves approaching.